I never imagined my life would take such an unexpected turn. At 28, I thought I had everything figured out. My career in software development was flourishing, and my relationship with Emma was the perfect foundation for a future together. Yet here I am, sitting in the dim glow of moonlight streaming through the kitchen window of her family's mountain retreat, my mind racing with thoughts I can't seem to organize. The day had started normally enough. We'd arrived at the Bennett family cabin in Big Sur, a stunning wooden structure nestled among ancient redwoods. The drive up had been typical, Emma chatting animatedly with her mother in the back seat while I sat beside Dr. Richard Bennett, her father. The renowned neurosurgeon maintained his usual composed demeanor behind the wheel, occasionally making small talk that felt more like professional interviews than casual conversation. What happened later, though, was anything but typical. After lunch, Richard suggested a walk, and we found ourselves at a secluded waterfall, a place he claimed held special memories from his youth. The air was crisp, filled with the sound of cascading water and birdsong. When he began removing his clothes to swim, I followed suit, thinking nothing of it. But what transpired next was something I could never have anticipated. Back at the cabin that evening, after a seemingly normal family dinner, I found myself unable to sleep. The events of the day kept replaying in my mind. The way Richard had looked at me, the charged atmosphere between us, the unspoken understanding that passed without words. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Emma, and made my way to the kitchen for some water. That's when I saw him, standing in the doorway, illuminated by moonlight, wearing only his pajama bottoms. His presence filled the room, just as it always did, but this time there was something different, an intensity in his eyes that made my heart race. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, his deep voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, suddenly aware of how dry my mouth had become. He moved closer, each step deliberate, until he was standing right in front of me. His hand reached out, resting gently on my shoulder. The touch sent a jolt through my body, awakening sensations I didn't know how to process. "It's okay," he murmured, pulling me into an embrace that felt both comforting and electrifying. Now, sitting here alone, I'm torn between two worlds. There's Emma, the woman I love, who fills my days with laughter and warmth. And then there's this connection with her father that defies explanation. It's not just physical. It's something deeper, more complex, that I can't quite put into words. As the first light of dawn begins to filter through the trees, I know I need to make a decision. These conflicting desires are consuming me, pulling me in directions I never imagined. Whatever choice I make will change everything. All I know is that I can't continue like this, caught between two powerful forces that demand all of me. The morning sun filtered through the dense canopy of redwoods, casting intricate patterns of light across the cabin's wooden floors. As I lay awake in bed, pretending to sleep while Emma's gentle breathing indicated she was still lost in dreams, my mind raced with possibilities. The encounter in the kitchen last night had left me unsettled, not just because of what had happened, but because of what it represented. The boundaries I thought were clear and unbreakable now seemed dangerously fluid. Richard's behavior during breakfast was maddeningly normal. He read the newspaper, commented on the weather, and helped Mrs. Bennett clear the table, all while maintaining his characteristic calm demeanor. Each glance he threw my way felt loaded with meaning, yet completely inscrutable. Was he testing me, waiting for some sort of reaction, or simply moving forward as if nothing unusual had occurred? Emma noticed my distraction. "You've been quiet this morning," she observed, her brow furrowing with concern. "Is everything okay?" "Fine," I replied too quickly, forcing a smile that probably looked more like a grimace. "Just tired from yesterday's hike." Her expression softened, and she reached across the table to squeeze my hand. In that moment, guilt crashed over me like a wave. This was Emma, my Emma, the woman who had stood by me through countless late nights at the office, celebrated my promotions, and supported me when my coding projects hit roadblocks. How could I even contemplate jeopardizing what we had? Yet the memory of Richard's touch lingered, stubborn and persistent. It wasn't just about physical attraction, that much I understood. There was something profoundly unsettling about how he seemed to see through my carefully constructed facade, past the polished exterior of the successful software engineer, straight to the core of who I really was. With Emma, I was comfortable being the man I wanted to be. With Richard, I felt exposed as the man I actually was. The tension reached its peak during our planned afternoon fishing trip. As we walked toward the river, Richard's presence beside me felt both familiar and foreign. The forest path we followed seemed narrower than before, the branches reaching out like curious fingers. Each step brought us closer to whatever reckoning awaited us. "You're troubled," Richard stated matter-of-factly, breaking the silence that had stretched between us. His voice carried that same authority that had intimidated me since our first meeting, yet now it held a softer edge. My throat felt dry, the words catching somewhere between my heart and lips. "I don't know what to do." We stopped at the riverbank, the water rushing past with deceptive gentleness. Richard set down his fishing gear and turned to face me fully. For the first time, I saw uncertainty in his eyes, perhaps even fear. "This isn't about what you want to do," he said quietly. "It's about who you want to be." His words struck me like a thunderclap. Who did I want to be? The question echoed through my mind, reverberating against the walls of my carefully constructed identity. Was I the devoted boyfriend who would sacrifice everything for Emma's happiness? The ambitious professional who measured success in lines of code and quarterly reports? Or was I someone else entirely? Someone capable of feeling things I couldn't name, wanting things I shouldn't desire? As we prepared our fishing lines, neither of us spoke. The sounds of nature filled the void between us. The rustling leaves, the babbling water, the distant call of birds. Each cast of the line into the river felt like throwing a question into the unknown, hoping for answers that might never come. "You know," Richard began, his voice barely audible over the river's song, "when I was your age, I faced a similar choice." He paused, reeling in his line before continuing. "I chose what was expected of me, what was safe. And while I've built a good life, there are moments." His voice trailed off, but his eyes met mine with an intensity that needed no words. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze of unspoken understanding and shared silences. By the time we returned to the cabin, dusk was painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Emma greeted us at the door, her smile lighting up the gathering darkness. Watching her, I realized that whatever decision I made would affect not just me, but everyone around me. That night, lying beside Emma, I stared at the ceiling for hours. The choices before me felt like diverging paths in a dense forest, each leading to a different destination, none promising safe passage. Sleep eluded me, and eventually, I rose from bed once more, drawn inexplicably to the kitchen. When I entered, Richard was already there, standing by the window and gazing out at the moonlit landscape. Without turning, he said, "I knew you'd come." And in that moment, standing in the soft glow of moonlight with the man who had become both my greatest challenge and deepest mystery, I understood that my journey was far from over. The questions remained unanswered, the choices still unclear. But perhaps, I thought as Richard finally turned to face me, perhaps that was exactly the point. The morning after our midnight encounter in the kitchen, I woke up with a sense of dread that settled in my stomach like lead. The sunlight streaming through the cabin's windows should have brought clarity, but instead, it illuminated the tangled web of emotions and decisions I needed to confront. Emma stirred beside me, her arm instinctively reaching across the space between us, seeking the comfort of my presence. Her touch, usually so reassuring, now felt like an anchor dragging me away from the truth I couldn't ignore. Breakfast was a tense affair, though I doubt anyone but Richard noticed. Mrs. Bennet hummed as she prepared pancakes, oblivious to the undercurrents swirling beneath the surface of our polite conversation. Emma chattered about plans for the day, a hike to a nearby ridge, perhaps some bird watching, but her enthusiasm only highlighted the distance growing between us. Every smile she directed at me felt like a silent accusation, though I knew she couldn't possibly understand why. Richard, seated at the head of the table, exuded the same calm authority that had always defined him. Yet there was something different in his demeanor today. His movements were measured, his words carefully chosen, as if he too were walking a tightrope between worlds. Occasionally, his eyes would meet mine across the table, and in those brief moments, I felt the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on me. Did he feel guilty? Regretful? Or was he simply waiting to see what I would do next? After breakfast, Emma announced she was going to help her mother organize some old photo albums they'd found in the attic. "You should join us later," she said brightly, kissing me on the cheek before disappearing upstairs. Her casual affection stung more than any argument could have. How could I face her knowing what I did? Knowing what I wanted? Left alone with Richard in the living room, I found myself unable to meet his gaze. He sat in an armchair near the fireplace, ostensibly reading a book, though I suspected his attention was elsewhere. The silence between us stretched thin, fragile as glass. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, I blurted out, "We need to talk." He lowered the book slowly, marking his place with a finger. "I thought we might," he replied, his tone neutral but laced with something unreadable. "Shall we take a walk?" The suggestion felt inevitable, though no less daunting. We stepped outside into the crisp mountain air, the scent of pine needles and damp earth filling my lungs. The path we took wound through the woods, narrow and uneven, forcing us to walk single file at times. The natural beauty surrounding us, towering trees, shafts of golden light piercing the canopy, the distant murmur of a brook, felt almost mocking in its serenity. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then, finally, Richard broke the silence. "You're carrying a burden," he said, his voice steady but tinged with something softer than his usual authoritative tone. "One that doesn't belong to you alone." His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I opened my mouth to respond, but no sound came out. How could I explain what I barely understood myself? The pull I felt toward him wasn't just physical. It was something deeper, something that challenged everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and identity. "You're afraid," he continued, his gaze fixed ahead on the trail. "Afraid of what this means, for you, for Emma, for everyone. But fear doesn't have to dictate your choices." I stopped walking, forcing him to turn and face me. "How can you say that?" I demanded, my voice trembling despite my effort to stay calm. "This isn't just about me. It's about Emma, about her family, about everything I've worked for." Richard studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a sigh, he gestured for us to sit on a fallen log nearby. "Let me tell you something," he said, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "When I was younger, I fell in love with someone I shouldn't have. Someone who challenged everything I believed about myself. I walked away from it because I thought it was the right thing to do. And maybe it was for them, but not for me." His confession startled me. I had always seen Richard as the epitome of control, of doing what was expected. To hear him admit to such vulnerability was disorienting. "What happened?" I asked, my curiosity outweighing my hesitation. He smiled faintly, a wistful expression softening his features. "Life went on. I married, had children, built a career. Everything society told me I should do. But there are moments, late at night, when the house is quiet, when I wonder what might have been if I'd chosen differently." The honesty in his voice was staggering. It made me realize that the man I had always seen as unshakable was, in fact, as human as I was. Flawed, uncertain, searching for meaning in a world that often demanded conformity. "But you're happy, aren't you?" I pressed, desperate for some kind of reassurance. With your family, your life? Richard's smile faded, replaced by a look of quiet resignation. Happiness isn't a constant state, Ethan. It's fleeting, elusive. What matters is whether you can live with the choices you make. Whether you can look in the mirror each morning and recognize the person staring back. His words struck a chord deep within me. I thought about the version of myself that Emma loved, the dependable, predictable man who fit neatly into her vision of the future. And then I thought about the version of myself that emerged in Richard's presence, raw, uncertain, yearning for something I couldn't define. Which one was real? Or were they both parts of me, fragments of a whole I hadn't yet pieced together? We sat in silence for a while, the forest around us alive with the sounds of nature. Eventually, Richard stood and extended a hand to help me up. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's head back. You have a lot to think about." As we retraced our steps toward the cabin, I realized that Richard wasn't offering me answers. He was giving me permission to seek them. Permission to question, to explore, to confront the truths I had been avoiding. It was a gift I hadn't expected, and one I wasn't sure I was ready to accept. By the time we returned, Emma and her mother were in the kitchen, preparing lunch.